Today we'll talk a little bit about sociology of sex and gender, and the main thing that I'm going to talk about today is how gender influences work, which your chapter, as always, does a good job explaining. And a lot of what your book talks about is how women are impacted in the workplace. There's a big discussion about the wage gap and glass ceiling and those sorts of issues. But what I wanted to quickly talk about and just give you a snapshot of were some of the disparities in pay between women and men. Sometimes you see this number vary a little bit, but in general, women earn about 78% of what men pay. And even whenever we control for the sort of work that men and women are doing and control for them working full-time and in particular industries, we still see that wage gap maintains, and it's mirrored pretty much across different industries. And there's been different explanations or rationales for why that gap exists. And what we sometimes have heard is that women are choosing lower paying jobs. They're choosing part-time work, or they're choosing jobs where they can more easily exit and then re-enter, and oftentimes due to pregnancy and childbirth and family responsibilities. So part of the issue, or the, I guess, limitation of that is how much of a choice is that if you're making those decisions based on your family life and family obligations. Gender discrimination, of course, is a big component of the wage gap. It's illegal to pay women and men different salaries, but there's still ways that it creeps into contracts and job offers and promotions and those sorts of things. And what we see is that oftentimes early on in men and women's careers, there can be a different starting point for their salaries and their base pays. And again, sometimes that's just tied to the evaluations that we have of men and women. Historically, there was this precedent that men, and specifically men with families, were paid a family wage, so they were automatically bumped up in their pay grade and their salaries if they were married and if they had children. So it was built into that system. That discrimination essentially was built into the system of pay for men versus women. That's illegal today, but like I said, there's other ways that can seep into the system. And then finally, the glass ceiling, which I imagine, very familiar with, that invisible barrier that women have difficulty getting promoted beyond that at some point in their careers, and usually that's at mid-management levels. So there's been lots and lots of increases in women's participation in the paid labor force, more representation of women, but still there's this, it kind of feels like this invisible ceiling that's preventing women from moving into those upper positions. And there's more higher status positions with more pay and authority, salary, etc. And here's a couple of charts, and I think similar charts are in your book, just again showing different representations over time of men and women's pay and how that's shifted over time. And of course, I'm going to draw your attention to this, looking at the male-female earnings ratio. So that's, the good news is that if we compare how things have changed since the late 1950s, where women were paid 60 cents on the dollar for every dollar men earned, that's an important and noteworthy increase over time, but there still is, of course, some work to do. And if we look at median weekly earnings by education and by sex, this is what we see here. So the one thing that I'll draw your attention to, men's salaries are in this teal kind of green bar, lime bar, and then women's are in the purple bar right here. And so what you see is that there is a disparity at every level, but the disparity is bigger, and there's a bigger wage gap in what men and women are paid as we move up the educational attainment system, which is not the way that it should be, not the way that we imagine that it would work. But that's what we do see, is that there's a statistically bigger gap as we move up that educational ladder. So it doesn't disappear unfortunately, whenever women earn their college degrees or earn their advanced degrees, whether that's master's, law degrees, medical degrees, PhDs. There's still a wide gap in pay. And disparaging to hear that, but this is the reality. This was 2014. So things have changed a little bit, but not dramatically since then. So what I'm going to shift our attention to next is to talk about men and men's experiences in the workplace. And really what I want to talk about today is this idea of the glass escalator. This was an idea that was a concept that was coined by Christine Williams in her book called Still a Man's World. And this, really what she was doing in this book was she wanted to see whether there was a glass ceiling for men who worked in, quote unquote, women's lines of work. Kind of testing that idea for men. We know that women, whenever they enter male-dominated lines of work, there's this invisible barrier. Is that the case for men? And I'll start with this premise here, or not premise, but start with this concept that she coined and this trend that she discovered, is that there certainly is not a glass ceiling for men whenever they entered female-dominated lines of work, but it's actually the inverse. We see that men tend to succeed by leaps and bounds whenever they enter these lines of work. They're promoted at faster rates compared to the women that they literally work with. And then they're channeled in specialties that are considered more legitimate for men. We'll look at some of the themes, but what she found is that some of the men who were in these lines of work were symbolically kicked upstairs. They were forced into these promoted positions, which came with advantage. Definitely got a salary bump and more authority and more prestige, and more autonomy in the work that you do. But there were some men, and specifically men who worked in elementary schools as elementary teachers. A lot of these men said, I went into this field so I could be in front of the class and so I could teach children. And I was kicked upstairs into these administrative positions. I was not forced necessarily, but very strongly encouraged and pushed to move into these administrative positions, vice principal positions, principal positions, other administrative positions. And they were, in some ways moved out of the classrooms into these higher positions. Like I said, that came with a lot of benefit. They had more pay and more authority. But a lot of times this was almost against their will. I mean, they could have said no, of course, and some of them did, but just the idea is that this was going to be good for their careers if they did that, and that those opportunities arrived far earlier in men's careers compared to women. So we're going to look at a couple of different studies. Like I said, the main study comes from Christine Williams' book called Still a Man's World. And there's been other sociologists that have studied other men in female lines of work. And we're going to look at several studies that look at men nurses, men teachers, and specifically men who are elementary school teachers, men who are in librarian positions, social workers, and clerical workers. So all 5 of those lines of works, as you imagine, and you already know this before I'm even tell it to you, those are historically and currently female-dominated lines of work. So what happens whenever men enter these lines of work, and what are their experiences like? That's generally what Christine Williams wanted to investigate. And part of what she found is that whenever you're a man, one of the rare men, or a token man in one of these lines of work, in some ways that can influence how people see you in terms of your masculinity. And generally what Christine Williams and other sociologists found is that men in these lines of work need to do extra work, or they need to enact these strategies so that they can retain that masculinity regardless of them being employed in these female lines of work. So we know all the stereotypes about men who are nurses and men who are secretaries or clerical workers and so on. So that is a real consequence, and that's looking at one of the social consequences of this. So one thing that these scholars have found is that a lot of times when men move into female-dominated lines of work, a lot of times they'll adopt a specialty area that's more male oriented or seen as more appropriately male. So social workers, a lot of times they'll move from being school social workers to being corrections social workers. There's more, like if you're working in that context, there's more masculinity that might be imbued in that line of work compared to working in just the broader public school system. Um, Other men emphasized masculine aspects of their work. So a lot of times they would focus on the power and authority. They would say, I might be a male nurse, but I'm the head nurse or I'm the floor nurse. I'm in charge of all the other nurses. So really emphasizing that power component of their work, or that authoritative component of their work. Sometimes they'd emphasize the physical aspects of their work. Teachers who were special ed teachers would talk about how, hey, they might just be children, but they need a strong male presence. Some of these kids can be violent, and you really do have to assert your authority. In terms of renaming and reframing the work that they did, there was, but as it says here, this pathological avoidance of the term secretary. Men who were in secretarial positions, sometimes by their bosses themselves, they wouldn't be referred to as secretaries. We can't call you a secretary. We're going to call you a word processor. They would come up with these distinct job titles because it just was beyond the realm of possibility that a male could be a secretary. There's so much gender imbued in that term or in that role that they would give them a new fancy job title, essentially. And they'd focus on technical competencies, especially librarians. They would say, we're not librarians of years past, but really we're computer gurus. All the work that we do is online and on computers. I'm very much a computer tech person, even though I technically am a librarian. They borrow the prestige of the workplace. Sometimes clerical workers or paralegals that worked for law firms would highlight the firm that they looked for, but not necessarily talk about their role in that organization. So they would just say, I work for X and Y law firm, rather than say I am a paralegal at this particular law firm. And then others would pursue higher administrative positions, use their current job as a way station or a springboard to future more higher status positions. Paralegals, that's one case in point. So a lot of the paralegals that were interviewed in these studies would say, well, I intend to become a lawyer one day. I'm going to apply to law school, and this will be good prep work for me working in this law firm as a paralegal. Later on in the interviews, they really hadn't done any work, and it didn't seem like they actually were going to apply to law schools. Maybe they were, but really it seemed like almost like a cover story for them, which brings us to the last couple of items here. A lot of times these men would have a story or just a rationale for why they were in the work that they were doing or in the job that they were employed in. So men who are secretaries, a lot of times their co-workers would say, why are you here? Why are you a secretary? Why aren't you doing something else? So if you think about that, women are almost never asked that same question. Women in secretarial positions are almost never asked, why are you in this position? But because men are the token employees in this sea of women, that is a question that they're often asked. So a lot of times men would say, well, I'm really an artist or a writer or an actor waiting for my big break. This is just to help me pay the bills. I have student loans that I have to pay off. So there was a cover story that they did have to explain their presence there. And then finally, there were some men that would have little connection to their work. And ironically, even some men that invested a lot of time in training. So a lot of male nurses would say, I don't really like nursing. I do this because there's good pay and I can, live a good life and have a good lifestyle. I wouldn't be able to live in New York City. I wouldn't be able to live in California were it not for the work that I do and the salary that I get from being a nurse. I love my lifestyle. I don't love this job. I'm more than just this job. So all these all these strategies that they enacted were one way to explain their presence in these worlds, but also to try to maintain their masculinity, that sense of masculinity in their world.